When you look at the last two national champions and what Oregon's doing, Dan Lanning's doing it right.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. If you have not, drop me a mailbag question or subscribe or do both. Maybe all of them. Hit me up on Twitter. Any engagement is always welcome on my end. So, how Dan Lanning's building this roster, what to expect from the offensive line, and Oregon basketball's back? Ish, kinda, maybe. Lots of thoughts there. But with a Pac-12 level call at the end, Oregon overcame. That was great. But what's also great is how Dan Lanning has acquired talent for the Ducks. So there's a really interesting piece I came across over at CBS Sports by Chip Patterson. Go check it out if you haven't. There's a lot of really good information in there. And the premise that he lays out is that there is a ceiling for transfer portal heavy teams, which he identifies as schools that are bringing in 20 or more players in a given cycle, Indiana this past year, or USC and Lincoln Riley's first season, or Colorado the last couple of cycles as well. And he says, there's a ceiling on what they can do because it can't give you all the depth that you need, can't give you the cohesion and team chemistry that you need in order to get there. And I largely agree with that. And I wasn't actually expecting Oregon to come up in the piece because he identified the last two champs, Michigan and Ohio State, not in that order, as, if you're going backwards, anyway. So as schools that have not been super portal heavy, neither one of them really was. They were senior laden. They were built through high school recruiting. It took a very long time for them to get there as well. A good thing to remember, Lanning's going into year 4. Jim Harbaugh was hired at Michigan in 2015, 2016, around that time. Pretty sure it was 2015. Ryan Day took over the year before COVID. So it doesn't happen overnight. I still stand by that Oregon had a real chance this past year. But is Lanning making something that resembles what the other recent national champions have done? The answer is yes. Doesn't mean it's a one-for-one carbon copy, because what Chip Patterson argues is that Oregon is a hybrid model, because Ohio State and Michigan both took a single-digit number of transfers the year that they won the national championship. Ohio State took 7 this past year. And really, not even all of them were hugely impactful players. Now, not all of Oregon's 10 transfers in the 2025 class are going to be hugely impactful guys. I don't know if Malik Benson has a huge role per se. I don't know if Kennedy, the safety transfer, nickel transfer from Ole Miss, is necessarily locked as a starter. Heck, I don't even know if Theron Johnson, the DB from Northwestern, is locked in as a starter. So that still remains to be seen, but Oregon is definitely not in the portal-heavy department. They are also not shy about using the transfer portal. We'll talk about the highest-rated guy they got in the portal this cycle later on today's show. But the single-digit transfer component and what Ohio State did this past year, where it was Will Howard at quarterback and Quinshon Judkins at running back and Caleb Downs at safety, and that was kind of it. The overwhelming majority of their roster was guys that they had recruited, developed, and retained. That's something Joel Klatt talked about a lot, and I don't think I've mentioned a ton necessarily, but I do hope is a part of Oregon's NIL collective strategy. You got to keep guys around. You got to keep guys coming back, and I do think they had that this past season. 5 years ago, I don't know that Terrence Ferguson or Jeff Bassa automatically returned. Bassa maybe, but T-Ferg, not really sure about that. Or Jordan Burch, maybe they go to the NFL draft. But I think there is that retention element for Oregon, and they understand the importance of that for keeping guys around. I'm sure they tried to convince Josh Connerly and Derek Harmon to come back, but I don't know if there was a number that you could have thrown at them realistically, because they're going to be first-round draft picks. At least that's how several mocks have them falling in this year's draft. But I did a quick, calculation, just kind of a rough estimate of the 37 most impactful guys for Oregon this year. Less than half of them are going to be either current, as in first-year transfers, or second-year transfers as well. Now, the number comes out to around 15, 16 or so, depending on, again, out of 37, depends on how a number of factors are playing out there. But I think the way that Oregon's going about it is kind of interesting when I thought about what Patterson laid out. Because Oregon is definitely more active in the portal than Ohio State and Michigan were the past couple of cycles. But they're also not trying to just build their roster through the transfer portal. They are doing that through high school recruiting. And with regards to retention as well, you also have to consider that Oregon still, in the Dan Lanning era, has not lost a starter to the transfer portal. Plenty of players have gone, nobody you'd consider a starter. They've brought in starters, never lost any to the portal. I think that matters. But Patterson described Oregon as a hybrid model, where they're not all in on the portal, but they're not just plugging a couple of spots. And the answer as to whether that can result in winning a national championship, I think, is to be determined. So far, we have seen Ohio State and Michigan going about it with very little, but very selective transfer portal additions, particularly Ohio State this past year, who only had 7 players commit, but had a top 10 class because of the caliber of player that they went after. And notably, that didn't cost them any NIL dollars whatsoever. Oregon's the only program in the country, of course, with NIL money. Heavy sarcasm right there. But this is something that I'm curious to see how it unfolds, not just this year, but next year as well. Who can Oregon get to come back? A guy like Dylan Thieneman, for instance, who I fully expect to be Oregon's starting safety this year, or one of them anyway. I think everybody has that expectation. He was one of the top transfer portal players in the country that everybody was after. Could they convince him to come back for a second year? Or does he come over to Oregon, have a big season, and then go off to the NFL because his draft stock is so high, a la Derek Harmon a year ago? But if you ever come across, and I have on many occasions, online and in person, the idea that, well, it's just a bunch of transfer, there are just too many, pose the Derek Harmon question to them. Well, you're not building a culture if you just bring guys in for 1 year and it's a stopgap situation, it's all transactional, whatnot. Like, okay, I think there is a line. I don't believe that Oregon has crossed it into this is too transfer heavy. They're not going to be able to go compete for a national championship in the coming years. But a guy like Derek Harmon's a perfect example. Would Oregon have been a better team if they'd played a young guy like Amari Washington more, and maybe you saw some of true freshman Aiden Breland or Terrence Green in his second year or whoever? Would they be better off having played those guys this past season, all of whom are still on the roster, by the way, rather than bringing in Derek Harmon? No, right? Harmon is an incredibly good player. And something else that gets lost in this particular debate is the development of transfer players. Tez Johnson had his most productive season ever at Oregon. He would have had a similarly productive year had he not gotten hurt this past year. So just because Oregon brings in transfers doesn't mean they don't have the ability to develop guys on the roster, or that they're not doing it through the high school ranks. So I thought that was an interesting thought exercise when I came across the piece, hence why we're discussing it here on the show. Let me know what you think below in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on Twitter as well. But describing Oregon as the hybrid model, I think, is a completely fair assessment from Chip Patterson, because they're not as inactive as some schools, but they are also not anywhere close to the most active. You got programs like SMU that bring in a bunch of transfers. Louisville's done the same thing. Florida State was pretty portal heavy last year, and that blew up in their face. I think Dan Lanning has an understanding in this evolving landscape of NIL and the portal of how he needs to build a roster to go win a national championship. That's my belief. I don't think it happens this year, but 26, 27, I expect him to have a chance year in and year out, of course. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below, because I'm sure you all have many. What do we expect from the offensive line? This offensive line has been great the last couple of years. I think next year's unit could have a lot of similarities to this season. Hey, Locked On Duck fans, the future of college sports is here, and it's transparent. Before the Roy app, NIL negotiations often happen under the table, and fans didn't have a clear way to directly support the athletes that they love. Now, with Roy, you get to be part of the change and support Oregon athletes in the most transparent way possible. The Roy NIL app allows you to Choose the player you want to support, decide how much to contribute, and receive exclusive content from the athletes you back. The Roy app is giving fans control. No more uncertainty. Now you can provide transparent, impactful support and help shape the team and the future of college sports with your contributions. Download the Roy app now from the App Store and start backing Oregon athletes the way they deserve, with transparency, trust, and a real impact. This is the future of college sports. Join it now by downloading Roy and supporting your favorite players. So I've been thinking about Oregon's offensive line. Why? Because I'm always thinking about Oregon, and offensive line matters a great deal. So ESPN released who they believe is the most important transfer for every preseason top 25 team. Now, Oregon is likely to be a preseason top 10 team once again this season, as they were for 2024. And ESPN, the person who wrote the article, went with Isaiah World. Now, I don't think that's a bad choice. You know, within the last couple weeks, he got a bump up in the 24/7 Sports transfer portal rankings. They have him as the number one overall player that transferred this season, and Oregon got him. I suspect he starts at left tackle for the Ducks. So I understand it from that vantage point. I kind of thought it would be Dylan Thieneman, just because it's a little bit flashier, but offensive line flies under the radar and don't always get the credit they deserve, but get plenty of blame when they screw up and whatnot. But I was thinking about those two guys who I definitely regard as Oregon's most highly coveted transfer targets from this past cycle. You know, Emmanuel Prenon at USC, also one of the top 24/7 transfer portal players that changed teams this offseason, one of the top 10, I believe, and I expect him to start at guard for the Ducks. You've got Matthew Bedford in the fold that was a transfer last cycle and is going into his 7th season of college football. He probably starts. You got Alex Harkey in there as well, 4-star offensive tackle transfer from Texas State. And they're all going to start around Poncho. So this will actually be a bit of a different offensive line makeup, I suspect, than a year ago. And I still go back and forth. World, Thieneman, who's more important? Let me know what you think below in the comments, or hit me up on Twitter. Is Thieneman more important at safety or World more important at left tackle? That's a tough call. That's a tough call. But with this Oregon offensive line, I think there should be an expectation that it is similar at some level to last year. For those of you that remember, this is going to be a repetitive exercise. But for those of you that forgot because of how well Oregon's offensive line played most of the year, allow me to bring you back to week 2 against Boise State at home. Following a game against Idaho in which Alik Terry was trying to motivate the guys with a t-shirt that said 2.9 yards per carry Idaho, they came out against Boise State and couldn't pass protect. And they were run blocking, and just okay. And then eventually, Alik Terry and Dan Lanning figured out, hey, you know, if Poncho's at center instead of Charlie Pickard and we put Struther in at a guard, and we have that kind of works a little bit better. And that was, of course, the unit for most of the season. But, you know, Oregon played eight or nine offensive linemen last year. And I think that is, at the same time, unusual because of the injuries that they sustained, but also with big guys, shows you the importance of recruiting. Got to have options available out there at all times and not drop off. And I felt like Oregon's guards really did a good job of that. But in the first 2 games of the season, it was more lineup dependent, or lineup caused, I should say, but the offensive line wasn't good. They couldn't create consistent running lanes, and Dylan Gabriel was sacked 7 times against non-Power 4 opponents. And then by the Ohio State game, you know, the eventual national champions, they allowed 0 sacks of Dylan Gabriel. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. That was a phenomenal coaching job by Alik Terry over the course of the season. But with this upcoming offensive line, I expect that same sort of progression. The talent is there. World just keeps, you know, blowing up from an evaluation standpoint more and more as time goes on. And I'll be interested to see what he looks like against Oregon's defensive line, because I think there are a lot of great players over there. I mean, Isaiah World against Mateo Uiagalelei, Who are you picking in that 1v1 battle? I don't know. It's probably 5-5 if they go at it 10 times. But having that many newcomers, and yes, it's great that your signal caller is going into his second year as a starting center, that being Poncho, of course. But 4 new guys around him, man, I cannot see. I am really glad, really, really glad that Oregon does not have next year's schedule this year. First game next season, according to FBS schedules, is Boise State. I would want no part of playing a team like that with 4 new offensive linemen around a center. Because if you have Bedford at one guard, who didn't play hardly at all last year, under 10 snaps, Prenon, who came over from USC, that's your other guard, Harkey at one tackle, maybe he gets beat out by Janoris Wilson, I don't know, and then Isaiah World at the other tackle, that's just a lot. It takes some time to gel. And so my expectation for that unit is that they are able to perform at a high level by the end of the season, but I think there will be some growing pains in the first couple of weeks, like last year. I don't think it's a rotational matter where it's, hey, there's a clear deficiency at one spot out there, and they've got to figure this out, and they got to make a shift. I think it's just, offensive lines can take some time to gel. I suspect that they will. So, this mailbag question came in. I am now realizing that I did not jot your name down. Might have come from a Locked On Ducks insider. Don't really know, but you know who you are if you sent in this question. First of all, I will always be pissed at the Beavers taking anything from Oregon, but I'm wondering if Oregon State taking our O-line coach Hurts, assistant offensive line coach, our efforts to sign the elite O-line prospects that the Ducks are pursuing. Can you address this, please? No, is the short answer. Alik Terry has proven himself incredibly capable. They've got Cody Green committed in the class of 2026, who is one of the top offensive line targets in the cycle. They have been tied to 2 of the top offensive line targets in next year's recruiting cycle as well. And I think Alik Terry has done a really good job with production. I think we're still kind of waiting to see if he's the same level recruiter as Adrian Clem was. Because remember, Josh Connerly, who was the biggest offensive line recruit in recent memory and definitely panned out on that front, he was an Adrian Clem recruit, but he was also mostly coached by Alik Terry whilst playing. So I think Terry's going to be perfectly fine. But I'm not worried that Kavanaugh went to Oregon State and that that was really, he was the key all along. Like Kavanaugh's a veteran, wants to be a full-time O-line coach or the head O-line coach, so he goes to Oregon State where he's coached before. Like, that just makes a lot of sense. But Terry is the head O-line coach for a reason, even though he's significantly younger than Kavanaugh. I think Oregon will be just fine in that regard. Is Oregon basketball just fine? Well, they were fine enough against Iowa yesterday. And that Pac-12 memory that we all cherish so much was alive and well yesterday. All right, Oregon's won 3 games in a row. I don't really care how they look. You just got to win. Get in the tournament. Anything could happen. We have seen, as recently as last year, double-digit seeds go to the Final Four. Yes, it would be better if Oregon picked up a key win coming down the stretch against Wisconsin and really allowed themselves to jump up seeding-wise. But after losing 5 straight, in which I'd say 2 of those losses were really bad and 3 are acceptable, but not acceptable. 3 are not season ending or defining per se. Oregon's won 3 straight games and they're doing it with offense. So I said after the Rutgers game, this team wins with defense. And in the final moments, that was true. Nate Biddle blocks the shot. I'll talk about the sequence that led to it. But he blocks the shot on the inbounds for Iowa. Putback doesn't get there. Oregon wins 80-78. By the way, Oregon, when last I saw, was favored by 1.5, and they win by 2. Vegas, man, undefeated. Undefeated. So, Saturday, early tip-off, Oregon, Wisconsin in Madison. I am not expecting Oregon to win that game. They don't need to win that game because after that, they have home games against USC and Indiana, and then they go at Washington. And if you win 2 of those, you're staring at a 21 win. They could win all 3, but if they win 2 of those, they're staring at a 21 win regular season with all those non-conference matchups that they won against Texas A&M and Alabama, and they've got a win over Maryland as well. It keeps looking good. They will have a tournament resume. No question about it. But this game against Iowa got crazy because why the heck not? Oregon had a lead at the half in this game, and they were at 45-37. Again, going on the road and having a great offensive first half. Remember the offensive woes this team had in the first half early in the year? Those are gone. They don't exist. They haven't been there. The new woe is still around because Oregon gave up 41 points in the second half. They gave up 50 against Michigan State, 41 here to Iowa. That continues to be an issue. And they came up big defensively when it mattered most. But that is still something I have my eye on that I'm convinced is going to burn them at some point in time. I just don't know when. But for now, it's 3 straight wins, and none of them are resume boosting, but they are also avoiding more catastrophic losses. And in the last couple of years, when Oregon hasn't built an at-large tournament resume, which they haven't done since the COVID tournament in 2021, by the way, these are the games that they lost, where we'd look back and go, wow, Oregon's 20-15, and if they just hadn't lost to Cal, or if they just hadn't lost to bad Stanford or Washington, that's what it was, and they've avoided it here. So that's a benefit to what this season is at the moment compared to the last ones, or an improvement, shall we say. But this game against Iowa got crazy at the end. And our Pac-12 memory, which we all have, RIP, Sweet Prince, forever and always, of bad officiating, it extends to the Big Ten too. I mean, we saw this in football with Ohio State. They missed the Jeff Bossa interception, don't get the replay buzzed down, complete and utter flop that cost Oregon 7 points. But they won the game anyway, so at least there was that. Here against Iowa, Oregon is trying to kind of run out the clock. They had a 2-point lead, and they run the most puzzling offensive zone offensive possession, as in they were going against the zone, I've ever seen. It results in Jackson Shelstad, who had his worst game of the year. By the way, talking about offensive progress for this team, Jackson Shelstad had 3 points and did not make a field goal, and Oregon put up 80 points on the road. So that's something to hang your hat on if you're the Ducks in this spot. Biddle had 21, 10, and 3 blocks. Evans was great off the bench, 8 points, 3 boards, and 2 rejections. So what happens on this possession is Jackson Shelstad moves the ball to the side. They're just draining clock, and then they don't drive, and Shelstad just shoots it from way outside at the logo, and he banks it in. And it gives Oregon a 5-point lead with less than a minute to go. It all but seals the game. And then the officials go to the monitor to look at it. And we all watched it on TV. This is what's so frustrating about bad officiating is it's not as if it's just the people in the arena that get to see what they're calling. We all see it on TV with all these different angles. And we could all see that by, a fraction of a second, the ball was out of Shelstad's hand. There were multiple angles where it looked like the ball wasn't out of his hand in time. There were multiple angles where it was clear that it was out of his hand in time. And it was called on the court a good shot. And the broadcasters, Kevin Kugler and Robbie Hummel, I give them credit because they were adamant about the fact that there was no way anything was conclusive, which it wasn't. And it got overturned anyway, which was insane. It was totally insane. I still can't believe it happened. They had this great frame-by-frame clip. Shout out to the Big Ten Network production crew, where the clock was on one side. You had a good angle of the shot clock, and then on the other side, you had a good angle, or an angle, I should say, of Shellstad shooting the ball. And as the frame on the right with the shot clock ticked from 1/10 to 0, the ball came out of Shellstad's hand. They showed it several times, and they still overturned the call. So why did I go on that sort of rant if Oregon won? Because Oregon won. We've seen it too many times. I still get annoyed and frustrated, but not as much as I used to, because you know what? Officials aren't good. I never expect them to be good. I expect them to get the big stuff right, like stuff that's right in front of my face that we can all see is correct. But the fact that Oregon, a veteran-laden team, was able to overcome it in that moment, and a late turnover by Shellstad on an inbound, they had every opportunity to be frustrated, get mad, but they just stayed. Next play, make whatever needs to happen. And Nate Biddle goes out and blocks the shot, his third of the night. He led Oregon with 21 points. That's what really good teams, football, basketball, baseball, I don't care. You're going to come across atrociously bad calls. That was an unacceptable overturn call. If I were Dana Altman, I would be emailing the league office, which is a regular thing coaches do, and say, hey, this was crap. There is no way that you can conclusively overturn the call on the court. If anything, there was evidence to support the fact that it was called correctly on the court initially. But that took 3 points away from Oregon, and they still got it done. And that made it feel extra good. So if they can carry that momentum into a win against Wisconsin on Saturday, coming into this game, bracketology had them projected as an 8 seed. And sure, I'd love for them to get up to a 7 or a 6, but quite frankly, anything that is 6 or below, you're in a toss-up game. You just are. Oregon was an 11 seed last year, beat 6 seed South Carolina. Like the 11-6 cutoff and 5-12 cutoff, 12 seed wins every year pretty much, but they don't win at the same clip that 11 seeds do. 11 seeds, it is close to a 50-50 proposition. So once you're in that range, it's all a toss-up and anything can happen. But that was an insane call. It's still an insane call to me. I cannot believe that they changed it. But Oregon won. That's what matters. They've won 3 straight. If they win at Wisconsin on Saturday, let's rev the hype train back up. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.